Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video review. This time of a movie. It's been a while since I've done one of these. I tend not to give movie reviews of every single movie I've seen. Some of them, aren't really worthy of too much of those. But since part of this channel is supposed to reflect my interests and what I'm passionate about, and maybe again in the future, maybe when my kids are grown, they can look back on this and kind of see what I liked and didn't like, when I was younger myself. I do want to do a few reviews of what I consider more important movies and things like that. So I think the last movie review I did was of the Captain Marvel movie. So of course this one is going to be Avengers Endgame. And I never did a review of Avengers Infinity War because I hadn't really started doing that when I saw that movie a year ago. So, just some backstory. Of course, not a big surprise if you've followed my channel and seen some of the things I collect, that I'm a really big Marvel Cinematic Universe fan and a pretty big, Marvel fan to begin with. I mean, I was watching Sam Raimi's Spider-Man and Bryan Singer's X-Men from the very beginning. Wasn't a huge Avengers comic book reader, but I read a lot of X-Men comics when I was in high school and things like that. So of course I've seen all 21 previous movies of the Marvel Cinematic Universe in theaters. And so of course, so I am one of those fans who are pretty deeply invested in it. 10 plus years, 21 films, and I know the stories pretty well. I mean, not super well, to the point where I've say seen every movie multiple times, but I've seen a few multiple times, and every one of them at least once. So the anticipation for Endgame was of course very, very high. Infinity War, I actually saw Thursday night. Got my wife a little bit angry at me because I actually saw it before her because I was so terrified of being spoiled because it was such a big deal. So to sort of defray any of that, make sure don't repeat my mistakes, this time around we planned it out, and we actually pre-bought tickets to see it Thursday night. Actually, I wanted to see it on IMAX, which was I think the 6 o'clock showing, and it was just insane. Just to compare, for Avengers Infinity War, I saw that Thursday night kind of on the spur of the moment. I was eating dinner, and then just sort of decided at that moment, okay, I'm going to just go for it. And I just walked up and paid the ticket, and I was at the 7 o'clock showing. And this year, for Endgame, it was a whole different ballgame. It was absolute insanity. There were rumors about the date that tickets were going to go on pre-sale. As I'm sure most of you understand, you don't need to do these type of things for movie tickets. This is not like Hamilton or something like that on Broadway. It's a movie theater with literally hundreds of seats. Normally the expectation is just to show up and buy the ticket on the day that the movie releases. But this movie was so massive. There were rumors on social media, Facebook, about the exact day, so I marked it. And since you normally never have to buy movie tickets beforehand, I really wasn't sure what the rules were, So was it midnight? Was it not midnight? Was it midnight East Coast time, West Coast time? It was just a completely uncharted territory. And so I remember, kind of staying up until around midnight, and nothing was going on. Fandango wasn't letting me buy the tickets. And so I just went to sleep. And then I think around 5:45, 5:50, around that time in the morning, I woke up, I went to the bathroom. And then on the way back, instead of going to sleep, I was thinking to myself, well, it's the next day. Let me just check my phone to see if the tickets can now be bought. And of course, to my surprise, it could be. And so I immediately went to the IMAX showing and tried to buy seats. When I looked at it already, literally I think about 85% of the seats had already been had bought. And there was only the front row left, and there was a few seats. I was trying to buy it for my family and also a friend and his family. So there was going to be 7 people. And as I was desperately trying to buy the 7 seats, they were just disappearing. It was like Thanos snapped away half the movie theater's tickets, and then you try to buy it, and there would be an error. And then when you refreshed it, the seats would be gone. And so I couldn't even get IMAX tickets at 6 in the morning. And I wound up getting it on another big screen in the same theater. Still pretty good, but it was just insane. Of course, later on, you found out that once the central and western United States woke up, that they just crashed all the pre-order sales, all the movie ticket sites. People were queuing in line like an hour and a half or longer to just be able to try to get tickets, and sometimes sites will crash even after they got access. So it was kind of a fiasco. And in retrospect, we all found out that this was timed for the East Coast at 8 in the morning East Coast time, which would have put it around 5 in the morning Pacific time. And so by the time I woke up, it had already been about 45, 50 minutes after tickets had gone on sale, which means that there were people basically waiting up all night trying to get these tickets. So there you go. I saw it Thursday night at 7 p.m., one of the first, on the West Coast to see it. And then I saw it again on IMAX Friday morning at 11 a.m. So I saw it twice opening weekend, which is pretty unprecedented. To be honest, I've never ever done that for any movie in my life. Not even some of the Star Wars movies, not for previous, Marvel Cinematic Universe movies. The first time I'd ever done that. And again, when you read on social media, you found out that the multiple people were, basically had pre-bought tickets to see it essentially once a day for the whole weekend. So this kind of sort of represents or illustrates just how passionate the fan base for this movie and this series is, and for how much anticipation really, there was for this movie. So in terms of my thoughts about the movie, my thoughts about Endgame, it's pretty, complicated. It's such a long movie at almost 3 hours. And so I think the best thing to do is just kind of get into it. Overall, I loved the film, but it was pretty devastating because, oh, by the way, it goes without saying that, again, if you follow my channel, I don't do any movie reviews without spoilers, so there's going to be spoilers throughout. So again, I'm about to spoil the movie from the get-go, because this is not the sort of movie that's really reviewable without spoiling it and getting into some nitty-gritty details and stuff. So yeah, it was personally just devastating because obviously, for those of you who've seen it, you know that it ends with Iron Man dying, with Tony Stark dying, and he's been, of course, the central character of the Marvel Cinematic Universe for over a decade. And so if you've been following all the movies, then you've basically invested very heavily in this character, and it's not too much, it's not a unique perspective to say that Robert Downey Jr. and his portrayal of Tony Stark essentially is the backbone of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I don't think that there would have been anywhere near the success that the MCU would have had without him and his portrayal of Iron Man. So, of course, I love the movie, but the ending was just pretty devastating. It took a while to get over that, actually, and to kind of put your thoughts together. So let's start from the beginning and talk about the movie in a little bit more detail, what I liked about it, and some of my nitpicks, and also some questions, obviously, that I raised from the movie itself. So the 3-hour runtime goes by actually very quickly. You don't feel it very much. And the reason is because when you analyze the structure of Avengers Endgame, there's really 3 distinct parts to this story. And many other, YouTube reviewers have mentioned this. And sometimes, they've split it into 4 parts or whatever, but I think there's really 3 main parts in terms of, how you feel and how the movie makes you feel. So the movie opens, and the first part of the movie, which is probably, about roughly, I would guess, 45 minutes to an hour, the first part of Endgame is actually pretty slow. It essentially extends the emotion and the ramification of what you see in the last minute or two of Infinity War, where you're coping with the fact that essentially half of all life in the universe has been extinguished by Thanos' snap. And there is this kind of element of disbelief and shock where, you just don't really fully comprehend that that's what happened, and you're almost in denial that in fact that did happen, which is an interesting theme that I'll get back to a little bit later on. Yeah, but that first part of the movie is pretty slow, and again kind of deals with the trauma and the sort of the world reeling from the fact that the half the world is gone, half the universe is gone. And this part was pretty slow. I think one of the criticisms of this part is like, man, I was like, it's really slow, it's really depressing, and you're just wondering, like, when are we going to get started here? When are we going to get back in the saddle here? But I think, this part of the movie, because it takes its time, is actually really important for a variety of reasons. I think the first is because, as unbelievable as it may be to imagine, there could be people watching this movie who really don't know much about what's gone on before it. You would think that watching Infinity War is mandatory before watching this movie, and I think that expectation is reasonable. That the vast majority of people who's in the theater watching Endgame have at least watched the movie that was released a year ago. But there are many, many people who I think are watching Endgame, who may be watching it simply because it's become like a cultural zeitgeist, because it's become a phenomenon. Everyone is watching it. Maybe they're there to support their friends. Maybe they're there because of their husbands or wives are dragging them to see it or whatnot. And they may not have invested very much into the previous 20 plus films. And so I think that if you've only watched Infinity War, then I think the first third of Endgame, we'll call it, phase 1, so to speak, or part 1, is there to really give you an idea of the gravity and the emotional stakes of what had been wrought. And it helps people who haven't watched the previous films to understand the gravity of the situation and to at least get somewhat invested in the stakes of what has happened. And also kind of sets the stage to kind of show that there doesn't seem to be any hope. It skips 5 years in the future after the Avengers go back and they kill Thanos rather quickly, but the victory is hollow because it's too late. He's already accomplished his goal, and then he's destroyed all the Infinity Gems. And so killing him is basically meaningless. That victory is like ashes. And then the movie kind of has the audacity to move 5 years in time. So 5 years later, there's basically almost like no hope from anyone, because, after the stages of grief, eventually, after all the anger and the bargaining and the denial, etc., I think it's like denial first. But in any case, after you go through all of the, I think it's Kubler-Ross. After you go through all the Kubler-Ross's stages of grief, you get acceptance. And I think after 5 years, they're trying to move into the acceptance part, which is, no, this is not a bad dream. It's not a nightmare. It's actually happened, and there's no takebacks. These people are still dead, and they're not coming back. And I think when you kind of show that and illustrate that, it does a great job of establishing, again, the mood and the stakes, so that the rest of the movie can resonate, not only with those of us who followed, this story for 20 plus movies and 10 years, but also people who've just basically come in just to sit down and appreciate the movie. For instance, my friend's wife, I don't doubt that she's maybe seen one, maybe two previous movies, but she's definitely not as heavily invested. So for her to really even get into the story, she has to have a feeling for what's going on and why she should care. So I think the first part of Endgame does a fabulous job doing that, and then skipping 5 years to quickly catch you up on where the different surviving Avengers are at in their lives, which is really interesting, and where a lot of the really cool surprises are sprung on you. And I think that Marvel did an amazing job hiding all of this from the trailers. I mean, really, it's phenomenal. Most trailers are trying to get you to go to the movie, and so they're obligated to almost show you too much. And of course, the Russo brothers have benefited from a rather unique situation where they don't feel obligated to get you to come to the movies at all, because they know you're going to be there no matter what. And so all the information, all the trailers are coming out from, like 99% of the trailers from the first 10 minutes of the movie, if that. So there's a lot of surprises and twists, which is really nice. You get to see Professor Hulk right from the get-go, which is interesting. You keep thinking they're going to try to explain things, and they really don't. I ran into this previously when I watched Thor Ragnarok, where Hulk started talking for the first time. And I think before that movie, the Incredible Hulk never talked, really. So you're thinking like, oh, how did he start talking? And they don't explain that. They just basically, say, okay, assume that you just have to accept the fact that he's always been like that. He just always kind of grunts and does have the ability to speak. We just haven't shown it previously. And so here, again, they don't bother wasting time showing you how, Professor Hulk came to be. He just is. And it's like a few throwaway lines from Bruce Banner. It's like, yeah, I've spent 18 months in a lab and just figured it out. Which does get back to one of my little quibbles with the movie, where certain aspects of the script can be a little bit anticlimactic. It's like, well, you look back on Infinity War, and Hulk refused to come out for the vast majority of Infinity War, to the point where basically Bruce Banner is being forced to use the Hulkbuster armor to be effective. And the movie ends with Banner saying to his outer ego internally, I have a lot of things to work out. So you think it's going to be like a little bit bigger part of the Endgame for us to see it, but no. I mean, it took literally 5 seconds, and it's like, from Infinity War, Bruce Banner saying, no, we got a lot of things to work out, buddy. And you get Endgame, it's like, we worked it out. It all occurs off screen. I mean, a lot has to happen in Endgame, so I understand why they had to do that, but it's still a little bit jarring when you get to, you kind of get slapped in the face with that. So that's one of the major changes. You see that Thor has fallen basically into a deep depression, and essentially has reverted back to his hedonistic ways from the first Thor. And so he's gained like a ton of weight. He's completely undisciplined, stuck in a little, he's just basically trying to escape reality, and he's just playing with Korg and his buddies. He's playing Fortnite and just drinking like gallons of beer, and he's just completely letting himself go. He looks like he's like 300 pounds. It's hilarious and also heartbreaking all at the same time. And then you just kind of see all these heroes trying to pick up the pieces. Some people were able to move on, other people not being able to move on. You do see, Tony Stark having married, Pepper. He built her the house in the woods that he had thought about in the past, and you find out that he has a 5-year-old little girl named Morgan, which was foreshadowed in the beginning of Infinity War, where he dreamed about it. Now, at this point, I have to say that I was struck by this amazing sense of dread. Anyone who knows me knows that Iron Man is like my favorite character in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I knew that one or both of Iron Man or Captain America was probably going to die in this movie. But there was a chance, when you want to bring a great hero's journey to an end, you kill them off, or there's a chance you let them ride off into the sunset. And I was always hoping that they would let Tony ride off into the sunset. But when they showed me his 5-year-old little girl, I can tell you that I was watching, Endgame for the first time. This sense of dread overcame me, because I was thinking, oh my God, are you giving us like this little 5-year-old daughter because you're going to kill him off? And so I have to tell you that for the remainder of like the 2+ hours runtime of the movie, while I was enjoying it, in the back of my mind, there was always this little sense of, again, this little sense of dread, this cloud over the, my viewing of the movie was like, oh my God, they're gonna kill Tony Stark here, right? Which of course, they did. So in any case, that's the first part of the movie, just kind of the slow, setup, showing how all the different heroes are at that point 5 years in the future, how they're dealing with things, Hawkeye becoming basically, essentially Batman, except he's the Batman who kills, becoming a vigilante, Ronin, all these things. And then the movie flips when Ant-Man comes back from the quantum realm from which he was trapped, back at the post-credit scene of Ant-Man and the Wasp. He comes back because a rat in the van that the quantum machine was in, that had been put in storage, the rat accidentally presses a sequence of buttons to turn the quantum device back on and expel Ant-Man from the quantum realm. There's been some debate whether this is a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek little Easter egg from the Russos, commenting on Disney and how Disney just acquired Fox and owns Marvel, and maybe doing a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek homage to the mouse, Mickey Mouse, right? Disney and all that. I don't think that has much to do with it, but it's fun, right? It's fun to make that little connection and to comment on it. So in any case, the second part of the movie begins when Ant-Man is freed, and he quickly catches up on what's been going on. There's a heartbreaking scene where he finally finds his daughter, who of course has aged 5 years in the time that Scott Lang, the Ant-Man's been away. And I think Paul Rudd does just this amazing acting. He's mostly known for his comedic acting, but I think he had this amazing scene, kind of the relief of knowing that she's still alive, but then it's kind of the devastation of finding out that you missed 5 years and 5 of the most important years of your little girl's life, and that you weren't there for her during the most devastating part of that life, So this is kind of, again, what makes, I think, Endgame a step above just a regular, comic book movie. Is it does show you these real emotional beats with really, really good acting. I mean, I think everybody brings their A game. And there's little moments like that I think elevate it above just a genre picture or just a simple comic book movie. So from there, of course, is born the idea that maybe you can go back and change the course of history by time traveling. And so while the first part of the movie is sort of the drama and the kind of the slow part, you segue into the middle part, which is essentially almost like an Ocean's 11 heist. In fact, I know Ant-Man calls it the time heist. And this is where things kind of begin to rapidly pick up, and where you start getting sort of whisked through the movie. And so in short, Tony comes back to save the day. Again, watching him come back, the sense of dread as he talks to Pepper about the risk, and of course, the fact that he loves his family. So you see you learn about the rules of the time traveling game in the Marvel Cinematic Universe and what's possible, what's not possible. And then they just basically go back, and the idea is they're going to try to get the Infinity Stones from different parts of the past to take the stones back into the future, and then reassemble, of course, the gauntlet to undo what Thanos had done. This is what they had tried to do in the beginning of the film, but they couldn't because Thanos had already destroyed the gems. And so now they're going to use the quantum realm to time travel to the past and then accumulate the gems from that perspective. You could make several videos sort of detailing, analyzing those aspects, and they exist on YouTube. for you to see. But suffice to say that this portion is tremendously enjoyable because it rewards people like myself and those of you out there who have watched all the previous films. And so it allows you to go back to those films, some of the most famous parts of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, like from Avengers, or from, say, Guardians of the Galaxy. And you go back to visit those films, but from a completely different perspective. And there are so many wonderful Easter eggs that they throw in there, and so much fan service that it's almost overwhelming. There's just so many amazing jokes and action sequences and callbacks, and just so clever that this is the part where you have to watch this movie multiple times just to be able to appreciate all the little nuggets and also to think through all of the implications of what they're showing you. And there's tremendous highlights in this part of the movie already. And if you're a Marvel fan, you have this big silly grin plastered over your entire face while you're watching this, because you're going to watch the end of Avengers, but from another perspective. And there's so many callbacks. You're seeing Captain America fighting against Captain America, and you're seeing kind of the annoying, choir boy scout, slightly kind of, like I said, I'm talking about like the original Captain America from the first Avenger, and the guy who was in the early part of the movie, The Avengers, who was kind of always holier than thou, and just a little bit, just kind of unlikable almost. And you're seeing that Captain America, of course, contrasted with the Captain America in Endgame, who's seen some stuff, who's been through personal loss and tragedy, who's lost friendships, who's been on the run as a fugitive for years and lost people. A guy who's seen half the universe disappear, who's seen his best friend melt into dust, and who's just a lot more cynical, right? This is the Captain America who's seen S.H.I.E.L.D. actually reveal themselves as Hydra. And sort of watching the interplay of those two Captain Americas while they're fighting, that was amazing. So that's one of the highlights. And I think Chris Evans, this movie, Chris Evans really shined quite a bit as Captain America, has some really unforgettable moments. This was one of them, when he goes into the elevator and you think there's going to be another elevator brawl similar to what happened in The Winter Soldier. It was one of the best sequences in the entire movie, The Winter Soldier. And then for him to avoid that battle by whispering "Hail Hydra," which is a callback to the comic book moment, I believe, was it the Secret Wars? I think it was Secret Wars arc in the comic, which basically shook everyone who followed comic books, because Captain America is such an iconic comic book character. And so for the writers to dare mess with him and mess with the comic book readers to suggest that he was a Hydra operative, this made the news. This was on USA Today. This made mainstream news that they decided to do this to Captain America. It was, I think, similar to when they killed Superman, back in the day, when they broke Batman's back. And so for the movie to have this clever little homage to that moment was genius as well. So many great moments, and then when they went back and when Tony had a chance to really talk to his dad to achieve the closure he never ever got, and to have that insight into his father that was kind of building, and now that he's a father. So they're just great moments through all of that. And we could talk all day about that, those moments there. Then of course, Thor and his amazing conversation with his mother. It's kind of interesting, that Endgame goes back to redeem two of the weakest movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And if you ask a lot of Marvel fans, I think there would be a lot of people who would be in agreement that Age of Ultron and Thor: The Dark World are two of the more unimpressive showings, more problematic movies. None of them are horrible, but those are two that are more problematic in the MCU pantheon. And it's almost like the Russo brothers went back to redeem those movies. There are tons of callbacks to Age of Ultron kind of casting Age of Ultron in a much more important light. And the time heist sequence with Thor almost single-handedly like redeemed the Dark World. It made the Dark World become essentially mandatory viewing, made it so much more important than it had been. And most people would say that the Dark World was like the worst movie in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and Endgame really kind of redeemed that movie. Or not redeemed it, but made that movie super important. And then, of course, the power gem in the Guardians of the Galaxy Morag sequence, which was critical for two reasons: to acquire the Soul Stone, and that little interplay between Hawkeye and Black Widow, and then of course the other side where they got the power gem actually rather easily, but then resulted in the Thanos of the past unmasking the plan and then eventually having himself brought into the future by using Nebula as a double. So all of the different portions of the time heist part of the movie were incredibly important and paced, in my opinion, very well and thoroughly enjoyable, and it moved the plot forward while at the same time rewarding you so much by giving you so much of what you wanted to see and sometimes what you didn't even know you needed to see, like the sequence with Tony meeting his father and all of these things. So that was genius, a wonderful part of the film. And quite frankly, after the first part, you kind of really needed that second part, because the first part's like a real downer. And I can see a lot of people either getting bored or just wondering, like, man, this is so slow. Let's get going here, right? So I think the second part was amazing, fantastic. So before moving to the third part, which is kind of like the climax, a few things to touch on from the time heist part toward, especially the climactic part of the second the second portion, which is the time heist. One of the most important parts is, again, the sacrifice of Black Widow. So up to this point, apart from all the heroes who were dusted from Infinity War, which at the back of your mind that they're all probably going to come back once we reverse the effects of the snap, right? Which is another thing that's really interesting, is that, the Russo brothers really went to the limit, because they ended Infinity War with the bad guy winning, right, with Thanos winning. And they didn't immediately turn it around in Endgame, to the point where 1/3 of the way through Endgame, you are continuing the theme of Thanos winning, right? Not only did he win, but he destroyed the stones, won permanently, and then you skipped 5 years ahead to deal with the ramifications of his ultimate victory. So the Russo brothers really pushed it to the very limit in terms of, getting you to feel or getting you to understand what it feels like to have the bad guy really, really win. And there's no MacGuffin, and there's no backing out of it until they finally bail you out. So up to this point, you still don't really believe that any of these heroes are going to be dead permanently. And on Vormir is where Black Widow and Hawkeye finally get to the point where one of them is going to have to die. And of course, I knew this the minute they went to Vormir, because we, of course, saw Infinity War and we knew what was waiting for them. And so that sequence, I thought, was very beautifully done. Unlike most people, I always figured that Black Widow would be the one to sacrifice herself. I figured, Hawkeye had a family, and for Black Widow, her family was essentially the Avengers, and she was the one who, through all of this time, was the most obsessed with trying to, reverse all of this. And I think there had been enough setup for her character from dozens of movies in the past, all the way back from Avengers, where she was trying to undo some of the bad things that she'd done as an assassin. That it did make sense that she would be the one to do it, but still, incredibly heartbreaking to see the two of them fight each other to be the one to sacrifice himself or herself, and to prevent the other from doing so, because they really had this brother-sister relationship and they cared so much for each other during all that time. Although you do wonder what would have happened if, and that's again one of the conceits of the movie, one of the criticisms of the convenience of the script, if, say Black Widow or Hawkeye had paired up with somebody random, like what if, for instance, like War Machine had gone there or something. It would have been a little bit weirder, like if Nebula had gone there with Hawkeye. They don't feel anything for each other. But it was pretty affecting to see that happen, and then to see Black Widow finally die. And so that is your first major death, actually, of the movie. And then that segues into the Hulk, Professor Hulk, being the one to finally reverse the snap. And then, of course, quickly Thanos is brought back into the future, the modern, current day timeline by his Nebula. And that's where all hell breaks loose. And that's where you begin essentially the climax of the film that just keeps you going all the way up until the very end. And that last hour is completely bananas. It's bonkers. It's something that, if you're like a kid who loves comic books, you would never in a million years have dreamed could ever be put on film. Because something you have to understand if you don't read comics is that, you have the awesome cover of a comic book and it looks amazing, but the interior art is not as amazing as the cover art, understandably so, and obviously so. They don't have the money or the time to do that. And so if you just go out there, either online or just buy a comic book, you'll see, that to cover those 32 pages of story per month, the art is okay, the ink, it's fine, but it's only so good. And so what's happening here is you have to extrapolate the amazing cover in your brain, use your imagination, and the lesser quality of the drawings on the interior sort of has to be augmented, right, by your imagination. And what the last hour of the Avengers does, of what Endgame does, is it takes essentially the splash cover, like a splash page where it's like, hyper good art. And it takes your imagination and it just basically puts it up on IMAX screen or something, on a big screen. And your mind is like just completely blown, from Captain America, finally wielding Mjolnir, to him finally saying Avengers Assemble, when all of the dead heroes are brought back and they come together again to fight Thanos. And it's just perfect, from beginning to end. And it's hard to describe, and it's like such a wonderful experience, to see it with a theater full of like-minded fans. And you get caught up, in the emotion. Your heart's pounding, you're like stunned, people are screaming. It's just a great communal experience. It's one of the reasons why it's so important to see a movie like this, in my opinion, as early as possible with real fans, because it adds an element to the experience that you can't get. And I'll tell you that watching a Thursday night with a packed house was still, different and a little bit better experience than watching it on Friday at 11 a.m., also packed IMAX. But the emotion wasn't quite the same, There were still cheers and stuff, but Thursday night was like thunderous. And so just a little aside for why a movie like this should be experienced as early as possible in a packed theater, because that experience is different. So of course, I won't go into the details about that, it's just amazing. And there's so many wonderful little, callbacks, and little hints as well. They gave a scene where all of the female characters and the female superheroes come together, and it's like hinting at A-Force, which is basically a female Avengers team. So people who don't understand that may think it's a little bit gratuitous or a little bit cringeworthy to have that little scene in there. But if you know that they're basically teasing an A-Force movie, maybe it's pretty exciting. And so that's the last part of Endgame, which would have been great, except it ends on, of course, the death of Tony Stark, because Iron Man finally gets those gems and essentially pulls like a magic trick on Thanos. He steals the Infinity Gems from Thanos, and of course he winds up snapping the gauntlet again and finally defeating Thanos and his armies. So, in a way, like I said, I told you about sort of my dread when I saw his 5-year-old girl, and this was borne out in the climax of the movie. And I always kind of knew that this would kind of go one way or the other. I thought that maybe Captain America would be the one to make the sacrifice, but as you begin to see how this movie comes together, it becomes more and more inevitable that it had to be Tony, because he's the one who created the nanotechnology to make the nanotech gauntlet to hold the stones. He's the only one who could conceivably get rid of the stones from his gauntlet onto his hand. It just became almost inevitable, as Thanos said, that Tony had to be the one to eventually get him and then use it to beat Thanos. In the comics, of course, Captain America eventually dies, and here Robert Downey Jr. took Captain America's death to be his own. Of course, I'm disappointed that they had to kill him off, because I love his character so much that you sort of wanted him to also, like I told you, the two ways of going out. I kind of really, and I'm sure a lot of people who love Tony Stark, like we all wanted him to kind of ride off into the sunset, like let him go off and marry Pepper Potts and be attached to Morgan. Let Cap be the guy to sacrifice himself, because that's much more his bag, right? That's much more his character for the entire, movies. But, that wasn't meant to be. And one of my other friends kind of told me, he goes, well, that may be true, but he says, you have to admit, you wouldn't have cared as much if anybody else had died except for Iron Man. And I have to begrudgingly agree that that's true. If you want to extract the maximum amount of emotion and pain, then you kill off Tony. And so they did that. So while I'm disappointed, it's hard to complain about that, because he did go out like a boss. If you're going to go out in any way, then wielding the Infinity Gauntlet, which normally can only be done by gods or truly superhuman, people, like for instance the Hulk, and then dying to basically terminate, up to this point, the most powerful villain in the universe and all of his armies. That is the most boss way to, I guess, go out that you can possibly imagine, But the movie definitely made people cry, did its best to bring tears out of you, from Rhodey and Spider-Man, and then Pepper crying over him, to the funeral, to the, proof that Tony Stark has a heart, all the way to his daughter asking Happy for a cheeseburger. It was tough. Now, I have a confession to make. I didn't cry the first time, probably because I was so shocked that they actually did kill him, that I was just like in denial the entire last 15 minutes of the movie. I kept expecting them to somehow bring him back in some epic twist. Because, of course, when time travel is involved, anything's possible. Even though I realized on some level, right, that on some intellectual level that would be a complete betrayal of the arc of the movie, but I was still hoping for it, to the point where even when they showed old Captain America, old Steve Rogers, old man Steve Rogers, I kept thinking maybe that's Tony or something. So the first time I watched the movie, I was in shock and in denial to really have any emotion. And also, eventually, when I realized what they'd done, my heart was filled with such hatred and bitter, and bitter anger that they had done this, that there was room for no other emotion. When I watched it the second time, I enjoyed it a little bit more because, again, I didn't have the pall and of the cloud of worrying about Tony the whole movie. I knew he was going to die. So I enjoyed definitely the entire movie much more up to him dying. But then reliving that moment, I did tear up a little bit because then I got more sad because I already got through all the anger and the shock. I already knew how it was going to end. So then you got more of the feels when you kind of saw everybody playing off of his ultimate death and sacrifice. Overall, they did a great job sending him off. And I feel like, it's something they kind of had to do, but it's going to be, on a meta level, pretty tricky. Again, I'm firmly of the camp that believes that the MCU would not be as successful as it is today without the unbelievable charm and charisma of Robert Downey Jr. portraying this perfect character. And even though, ironically, a lot of the movies, like Iron Man 2 and 3, were not great movies, but the character was great. And I think he appeared in 9 of the 21 or 22, depending if you count Endgame, 9 of the 22 movies. Yeah, right, he did 3 Iron Man, 4 Avengers, Civil War, and then Homecoming. Yeah, so 9 of the 22. So how are you going to replace his charisma and his kind of unique, force of personality? It's going to be tough. I mean, I hope they can do it, but kind of Chris Evans' wholesomeness as the perfect Captain America, and then Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man. Those are two characters that would be really, really difficult, I think, to replace. And I guess we're going to see, moving forward with Phase 4, whether they really caught lightning in a bottle with RDJ as Tony Stark, or whether they can recreate, that formula and continue to have success and tell great stories and give us great characters that we care about. So there you go, moving forward, it's the end of an era. And I am a little bit worried if I'm ever going to care about the stories of the Marvel Cinematic Universe as much without Tony or Cap. Now, they did give Captain America the happy ending, which is nice because it would be a little bit too much to kill both of them off. And so, Cap goes back to replace the Infinity Stones, replace Mjolnir, and then he settles down with Peggy and gets that last dance. Anyone who's paid attention the whole time knows that that's what they were going to give him. Although I still kind of hope that, if Cap had to sacrifice his happy ending and then die so Tony could have his, I would have opted for Tony. But that's just me, right? I'm of course, team Iron Man all the way. But it was sweet, it was nice. And it was, also nice that he would come back to give the shield and give it to Sam or the Falcon, right? Now that part is a little bit interesting. There's a lot of fans who felt that Bucky should have gotten the shield. And I'm of two minds about that. I understand why people feel that Bucky should have gotten it. He is Cap's best friend. But the problem is he's sort of like damaged goods. The guy was a brainwashed Hydra assassin for essentially decades. He murdered Tony Stark's parents, which interestingly enough, they sidestepped that issue completely by just basically killing Tony. So there never had to be a sort of a resolution to that. I mean, Tony mended his fences with Cap pretty quickly after everything. They didn't spend much time delving into that, which I felt again was a little bit disappointing. I mean, there was some really hard words. It was from Civil War, of course, and then even in the beginning of Endgame, when Tony was furious at Captain America still. And then it's like an hour in, there's like, look, 5 years has passed, the guy's married, he's got a daughter, he's like, we just gotta save the universe here. Let's just put this behind us, okay. I mean, but again, that ultimate resolution came a little bit too easy, I feel. And I wish there was maybe a little bit more spent on some heartfelt exploration of what was going on. So that is one of my little nitpicks of the film, is I wish that had been resolved a little bit better. Like, there's a lot of things that was built up, and then in the interest of kind of getting through the movie, it was just sort of resolved very, very quickly, which made things a little bit more empty when it comes to, like, really, like, like Tony was screaming at Cap. It's like, I have no trust in you. He ripped his arc reactor off and put it in Cap's hand. Like, he was giving him his heart. He's like, kill me. And I mean, it was like crazy. And then just like an hour later, he was just saying stuff like, like, what does he say? Like acrimony, or like it's poisonous. Resentment. I think it's like, resentment is poisonous and I don't like it. And Cap's like, yeah, I feel the same way. And then Tony's like, here's a shield. And all of a sudden they're comrades again, they're buddies again. That ran a little bit hollow, We always believed that the two of them would still come together again, because they respect each other, they are friends. But it would have been nice to have a little bit more meaningful conversation about those moments than just that, okay? But in any case, Bucky is damaged goods. He just recently got deprogrammed at Wakanda, and to have essentially a former trained assassin who's been very, very good at his job all of a sudden become the new Captain America probably wouldn't have been appropriate, and would have, again, rang a little bit hollow to do it immediately. And I do agree that Sam, in terms of his moral fiber, his ethics and his moral character, is the closest to Captain America's moral fiber. And so I think from a moral point of view, I think Sam is the most deserving to take up the helm, at least as far as everything's been set up in the MCU. But the problem I have is that from a logistical point of view, so there is like the heart says Sam deserves the shield, but the problem is, the pragmatic part of me always comes whispering, and it's like, Sam might be the most deserving, but he's like seriously underpowered. I mean, this is a guy, like, basically he's the Falcon. He has nothing. Like, he's just a soldier, and he has this suit that he can use to fly. He's really good at that. But he's one of honestly, he's one of the weakest Avengers. I mean, he's up there with, even Hawkeye at least has the power that he can't miss. It's like some sort of weird, supernatural almost ability, right? Like he never misses. I just don't know what Falcon has. I really think Black Widow could basically probably kick his ass. And so he's more like in the same category as like War Machine. You're basically the suit here. And I just don't see how that's going to work. It's like, he doesn't have the super serum. Bucky basically is kind of like Captain America light, right? He was the Winter Soldier, and they were augmented much like Captain America was augmented. And so from a power perspective, he would have been a more appropriate, seamless transition to be the new Captain America, honestly, right? Who wouldn't have wanted to see the metal arm wielding the metal shield, the vibranium shield? That would have been awesome. And what's Sam going to do when he fights somebody as Captain America? Who's he going to fight? one punch from some of these super villains, it's going to be like the end of the game, you know. So I don't quite know where they're going to go with this, but I hope that they do something with Sam to power him up, because otherwise, him gallivanting around as the new Captain America is not going to be very believable, in my opinion. And I don't think that he is a charismatic enough replacement for Chris Evans to make it work. So there's going to be a Disney Plus streaming show with called Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and that might be very interesting. And so maybe he doesn't assume the mantle immediately, and maybe we're going to get a little bit more story to see if that is going to be more reasonable, right? Or maybe if eventually maybe Bucky will get it. But I think Bucky needs a little bit more redemption from a moral point of view, or from a story and character point of view, before he can really truly become the next Captain America. So those are my just kind of general thoughts, and why, even though I love the movie, I have watched it multiple times, it's still really difficult, because again, they killed Iron Man, and I think, when you bring in time travel in any capacity, I think it does, to some degree, you muddy the story a little bit. And it's a kind of a dangerous thing. I mean, to the Russo brothers' credit, to the screenwriters' credit, to the script's credit, it's handled overall pretty well, but you can muddy the waters a little bit, and you leave yourself a lot of outs. For instance, excuse me, for instance, in the end of Endgame, you create two kind of cheats. In the original Infinity War, you killed Loki and you killed Gamora. And then in Endgame, you used the time travel to cheat, and you got Loki to escape back in 2012 in New York, near the end of the Avengers, creating an alternate timeline where that Loki then winds up alive. And who knows, with the Space Stone, he may be able to traverse maybe even, different multiverses and show up again in the Prime universe. And then for Gamora, you brought her from the past into the future. And as far as we know, she survives. When you do that, of course, you then begin to beg the question. A lot of things can happen. When Steve Rogers goes back to be with Peggy, he then has created an alternate timeline where he obviously stays there. It's hard to believe that in that alternate timeline, Captain America at his prime, with everything he knows, would then happily let his best friend Bucky be tortured, brainwashed, and turn into the Winter Soldier, that he would joyfully, while living a wonderful life with Peggy, who is one of the founders of S.H.I.E.L.D., by the way, watch her life's work then be infiltrated by Hydra, and then, oh, by the way, also see Howard Stark and his wife be murdered. I mean, it's a little bit hard to buy that, right? But that's the implication. When he goes back in that timeline, it's hard to believe that he wouldn't try to interfere. And with an alternate timeline, he very well could, and would have changed all of those events. And I think the Russo brothers hinted that maybe he does do that. We don't know. We'll have to. There might be a series, right, to show us that. Maybe on Disney Plus, on their streaming site. So when you do all of that, then the obvious question is, if you can bring Gamora from the past into the future to replace the previous Gamora that Thanos had to sacrifice, why can't you do this? Why can't you do the same thing with Tony and Natasha? Right? I mean, you have infinite timelines, and they still have a working, obviously, quantum machine from the end of Endgame. Obviously, they sent Captain America back, and Hank Pym, along with Scott Lang, still use it. I mean, so it's absolutely possible through the quantum realm to continue to do that. They still have the technology that Tony invented to provide control over where to go. So if Loki can escape and you can bring back Gamora, what's to stop you from bringing back another version of Black Widow or Iron Man, and they're back? But if you do that, you run the risk of essentially cheapening the entire sacrifice of Endgame. And it's worth noting that, you know, when you look at everything from a gestalt, you have to understand that the only characters that really died is Black Widow, Iron Man, and Vision. I mean, everybody else came back in one way or another. And when you consider that Disney streaming has a WandaVision in the works, and that Vision is like a robot that was being worked on by Shuri in Wakanda, there's every possibility that maybe Vision gets rebuilt and he comes back. I mean, which would piss me off so much that the only real people who died was essentially Tony and Natasha. And Black Widow has a movie coming out in 2020, which is really flabbergasting because, she's dead, so the only thing you can assume is that the movie is going to be a prequel. But if it's a prequel, at this point, then who cares? I mean, we all know exactly what's going to happen to Natasha, and every character in that prequel, we're going to know what's going to happen. How are you going to make that prequel interesting? And if it's going to be like a somewhat origin story for Black Widow, it's about 20 years too late. I mean, at this point, why does anybody even care about an origin story for Black Widow? You should have had that way back in phase 1 or phase 2, right? Because phase 1 was when you gave us the origin story of Iron Man, Thor, Captain America, and to a lesser extent, the Hulk. And you introduced, Natasha in Iron Man 2 and Hawkeye in Thor. So to go back even further and talk about Budapest with those two after Endgame, it just seems ridiculously anticlimactic. And why would we even want to watch that movie? It doesn't seem like the sort of thing that will work out very well. So I hope that Kevin Feige does something. So my personal hope, even though you can say maybe I'm still in denial or in bargaining phase, is I hope they give it a few years for the sacrifice to kind of sink in, for people to respect it. And then maybe a few years later, they can somehow bring back both in different capacities, because I think they might be needed to keep the interest there, and maybe in a few years, we'll get a chance to see how the new crew, like, Black Panther and Captain Marvel and whatnot, are they up to the task of generating the same level of interest, that Iron Man and Captain America did? And if they're not up to that task, then we might have to, finagle things a little bit. And I think it would be pretty fitting, because comic books do this all the time, where they kill off characters for a couple of years and they bring them back again when you need them for like a little shot of adrenaline to kind of spice things up and get things moving again, to get fan interest up again. They'll bring them back in a different way. So let's see if they decide to do that. I think there was some talk of maybe even, Tony Stark uploading himself as an artificial intelligence, as almost like a backup, so that he's not really gone, but he can still be there to give advice in that fashion. And if the guy can solve time travel, what can he do, right? I mean, you could argue he was pretty much already there with artificial intelligence, with Jarvis and Karen and whatnot. So there might be something else to explore moving forward, depending on how things go. So I've talked for like an hour already, and I've kind of shared most of my thoughts and feelings for the movie. I think there's a pretty good sense of how I felt, and I think that's about it. I mean, I guess I can end a little bit on, since I talked about Captain Marvel for like an hour last time, how did I feel about how she was used in this movie? I thought she was used pretty well. I didn't think that she was like a deus ex machina or anything like that. I think she was portrayed very powerfully and with a lot of respect, but I didn't think that she was abused. I didn't think she was used in a cheap fashion, and I think it was nice to show that as powerful as she is, she still wasn't quite powerful enough to beat Thanos, and you still needed something extraordinary, as Tony did, to be able to finally beat him. And there were just so many. She had so many great moments in a way, right? Where she was like, kind of single-handedly battling Thanos to a standstill, and it took him using the power gem to knock her into infinity, to get her off. And there was great moments, like when he headbutted her, she didn't blink. So she had some great moments. She wasn't in the film very much, but when she was in the film, she had some great moments. But I don't think that her moments were, like, say, any less than, for instance, the Scarlet Witch, who had just, in only, I would think, 1 minute of screen time, she had one of the most amazing sequences where, you showed her they showed her heartbreak and her hatred and her anger, and how she said, like, you took away everything from me. And of course, Thanos had no idea what she was talking about. And he was like, I don't even know who you are. And then she said, like, you will, and proceeded to, battle him literally, point for point, and then basically almost tear him to pieces before he had to get his ship to help him out. I mean, those were great moments. And again, I think that the female characters in this movie have some really, really awesome moments. So I thought that Captain Marvel was utilized pretty well. There was a lot of hatred, hate toward her. And of course, her movie did very well. And I think I liked the way she was portrayed and the way she fit into Endgame. And I think there was good girl power moments, in the last climax of the film. So I did enjoy that. So, again, it's the end of an era, and we'll have to see if Phase 4 can keep the momentum going. On initial, perusal, we don't even know where they're going with it, so we'll see. I think we're definitely going to have a Captain Marvel and Black Panther sequel. I think a Doctor Strange sequel is in the works. There's going to be an Eternals movie, a Guardians of the Galaxy 3. So that's 5 movies already that, boom, it's already there for the next couple of years. And then Shang-Chi, that's like a Chinese martial artist. Not too happy about that. I hope that Marvel can pull a miracle or a rabbit out of a hat, because, with Iron Fist already not doing great, that came, like, and then you give us another Asian stereotype martial artist. I hope to do something a little bit better than Iron Fist with this, but we'll see how that goes. I do have faith in Kevin Feige, that because he does such a good job so far, that he's not going to whiff on this. So we got 6 movies, pretty much already coming out. Don't forget, there probably is going to be another Peter Parker, Spider-Man movie, a third one after the one that's going to come out in a few months, and then that third Ant-Man and the Wasp movie. So there's enough movies for Phase 4 already set. And then we have Fantastic Four and, of course, X-Men already brought back into the fold for Feige to play with. So there's a lot of things that moving forward that can be done. But it is the end of an era. It was very satisfying. And I think overall, it's a great movie. I mean, I can't really complain too much about it. There's little nitpicks here or there, but overall, the movie is just so overwhelmingly good and gives you so much of what you want, that complaining about these little tiny nitpicks here or there is almost like complaining, like if there's a supermodel and you're complaining about the one little freckle, like, right here on her cheek. It just seems, it's just unbecoming, right, to do that. So definitely, I would say that it does not disappoint. It's definitely one of the greatest, comic book movies ever made. Probably the greatest comic book movie ever made in terms of doing things that you've never seen before. And of course, the only disappointment is on a purely personal level, that they had to kill off my favorite character of all time. But there's hope that maybe in the next couple of years, they might bring it back in one way or another. Because one of the coolest things about, Marvel is that Iron Man, his gadgets, his suits. You take away Robert Downey's personality, you take away Iron Man's cool armor and his gadgets. It's kind of hard to replace that. So I'm hoping that they're going to realize that, and they have to kind of do something to keep it going. Because I got news for you, Shang-Chi is not going to replace Iron Man. And I don't think I'm alone in saying that. I'm Asian, okay? So hopefully they can figure that out. So hope you enjoyed hearing me ramble on about Endgame and how it made me feel, how it sent me to a deep, dark depression for basically 2 weeks. I was not even able to talk about the film until then. But there you go. So until next time, do take care.